The year 176 AD does not open with a clash of weapons, but with the more subtle and disturbing noise of the calculations that are made after a long, expensive, and not entirely concluded war. It is a year that Rome experiences as a pause, a necessary truce rather than a definitive victory, and which the imperial power tries to describe as an accomplished success. On the Danube border, however, the reality is more opaque. The legions remain deployed, the barbarians are defeated but not tamed, the burned villages do not guarantee lasting obedience. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, emperor, and reluctant commander, enters 176 carrying the weight of over a decade of Marcomannic Wars, fought not for conquest but for the survival of the Roman order. Before the triumph, before the celebrations, before the golden chariot that will cross Rome, there is a heavy legacy left from the previous year, an unstable balance that defines every subsequent decision. At the end of 175 AD, the Danube front appears, on paper, to be pacified. The main barbarian coalitions have been broken, the most stubborn leaders killed or forced to surrender, incursions deep into imperial territory stopped. But this peace is the result of constant and brutal military pressure, not of real integration or shared political stability. The Marcomanni and Quadi, Germanic peoples accustomed to a fluid tribal structure and an often contested authority, suffered systematic devastation. Crops destroyed, villages evacuated, deportations of entire communities. The Sarmatians Iazyges, horsemen from the Pannonian plains, were struck at the heart of their mobility, deprived of their horses and forced to surrender through starvation rather than through great pitched battles. The Roman army, for its part, arrived at the end of 175 exhausted but still functional, a worn-out machine that continued to move through inertia and discipline. The losses were huge, especially among the ranks of the legions engaged for the longest time on the front, and the human turnover was guaranteed with extraordinary measures that clearly reflect the gravity of the moment. Forced recruitment in the provinces, enlistment of freed slaves, massive integration of subjugated barbarians into auxiliary units. It is no longer the ideal army of the manuals, but a real army, adapted to emergencies, which fights far from large cities and official ceremonies. On a logistical level, the situation on the eve of 176 is fragile. The supply lines along the Danube work, but are constantly under pressure. The warehouses must support not only the troops, but also the Romanized civilian populations of the border provinces, hard hit by the devastation of previous years. Added to this is the still vivid memory of the Antonine Plague, which decimated men and resources, leaving gaps difficult to fill both in the countryside and in the military ranks. Marcus Aurelius knows this picture well, and knows it not from afar. He spent long periods in the fields, he wrote philosophical reflections surrounded by mud, the cold and the smell of military fires, and he is aware that the war was not won in the classic sense of the term, but only contained. At the end of 175, the choice not to go further with a campaign of total annihilation was born as much from strategic considerations as from concrete limits. The empire cannot afford an endless war on that front without compromising other balances, and the decision is to freeze the conflict by imposing very harsh conditions on the vanquished. This is where the most delicate legacy that 175 handed over to 176 lies, a peace imposed by force, which requires a constant military presence in order not to collapse. The territories north of the Danube are not abandoned, but occupied informally, garrisoned by garrisons who live among hostile populations or, in the best of cases, subjugated out of necessity. This means that the Roman army does not really return home. It remains exposed, it remains engaged, it remains vulnerable to any change in mood or leadership among the barbarians. From a political point of view, the legacy of 175 is equally complex. In Rome and in the provinces furthest from the front, the war is perceived as long and expensive, and the consensus around the emperor, while solid, is not blind. Marcus Aurelius must demonstrate that the sacrifices had meaning, that the empire did not simply survive, but re-established its authority. This explains why 176 will also be the year of narration, of the staging of success, of the triumph that translates a much more ambiguous military reality into simple images. But before reaching that moment, the year opens with a series of unresolved problems that derive directly from the previous year. The management of returned prisoners, often traumatized and without means, the resettlement of deported populations, the surveillance of the barbarian leaders left in power as intermediaries, the control of an army which, after years of hard war, risks losing discipline if not kept constantly busy. The legacy of 175 is therefore that of an incomplete victory, which forces Marcus Aurelius to move with caution, avoiding both excess confidence and an immediate return to large-scale arms. It is a subtle balance, which requires personal presence, moral authority, and a command ability that does not end on the battlefield but extends to the daily management of men, resources, and expectations. In this sense, 176 was not born as a year of glory, but as a year of responsibility, in which every decision is conditioned by what has been done and suffered up to that moment. The war changed the face of the Danube border and had a profound impact on the empire, and the emperor knows it. Before celebrating, we must consolidate. Before recounting a victory, we must prevent it from turning into an illusion. 176 AD takes shape on the border not as a year of march, but as a year of control. Open warfare has retreated a few steps, but has not left the field. What remains is a continuous armed presence, a widespread surveillance that transforms the truce into a permanent military operation. The decisions taken at the beginning of the year respond to a clear logic: to prevent the defeated peoples from reorganizing, breaking any possibility of a coalition, and making the Danube not only a natural frontier, but an impassable line manned by Roman authority. Imposed treaties are not agreements between equals, but instruments of subordination. The Marcomanni and the Quadi are forbidden to approach the river, not as a symbolic measure, but as a strategic amputation. The Danube is trade, movement, contact, and denying it means reducing the capacity for autonomous survival. Men and horses are taken from the Iazigi Sarmatians, a people of knights, and the restitution of the Roman prisoners becomes not only a political clause, but an act of public humiliation, an implicit recognition of defeat. These treaties are not entrusted to the goodwill of the vanquished, they are guaranteed by force. About 20,000 Roman soldiers remain stationed north of the Danube, in territory that Rome does not formally annex but which it de facto occupies. It is a bold and risky choice, because it exposes the legions to a hostile environment, far from the large provincial bases, but it is also the only way to transform military victory into a lasting reality. The Roman outposts arise in calculated positions: passage nodes, hills overlooking the valleys, points from which to control the movements of the tribes and intercept any attempt to violate the agreements. They are not cities, nor stable colonies. They are essential military presences, built to last long enough to maintain pressure. Life in these garrisons is hard and inglorious. The soldiers live in a constant balance between vigilance and isolation, surrounded by populations who, although formally subjugated, remain strangers and often hostile. The Roman command is aware that it takes very little to transform an incident into a revolt, and for this reason discipline is rigorously maintained. The patrols move continuously, not to conquer, but to show that Rome sees and knows. On a strategic level, 176 is a year of consolidation that requires fine management of forces. The legions are not concentrated in large masses, but distributed in such a way as to cover the territory without offering easy targets. The auxiliary units, often recruited from the subjugated barbarians themselves, play a crucial role. They know the terrain, speak the local languages, but their loyalty is always monitored, because integration does not automatically erase the original belonging. Marcus Aurelius, although not personally leading every operation, remains the decision-making center of this system. His presence on the front, even when not constant, is perceived as a guarantee of continuity and severity. The emperor knows that the success of 176 does not depend on new spectacular victories, but on the absence of disasters. Every month that passes without a general insurrection is an achievement. Meanwhile, the administrative machinery of the empire works to translate the military situation into a sustainable political structure. Tribal leaders who accepted treaties are recognized and, in some cases, supported against internal rivals, because Rome prefers weak but dependent interlocutors rather than open enemies. It is a subtle game, which requires accurate information and a constant network of contacts. There is no shortage of tension: minor border violations, suspicious movements of armed groups, requests for food and protection that often mask attempts to probe the Roman reaction. With each episode, the response is calibrated to be immediate but not disproportionate, because the objective is not to reignite the war, but to make it clear that the truce has a specific price. In this context, the Roman army is increasingly transformed into an instrument of border police, without however losing its combatant nature. Training continues, fortifications are strengthened, and the idea that peace is only temporary remains implicit in every order given. 176 on the border is a year of armed waiting, in which stability is not given, but built day by day. Rome does not advance, but it does not retreat, observes, controls, punishes when necessary, and tolerates when it is convenient. It is a less flashy form of domination than conquest, but no less demanding, and requires a concentration of resources and attention that demonstrates how the legacy of war is still alive. While in the south the imperial power prepares to celebrate, in the north of the Danube time passes slowly, marked by the rhythm of the centuries and by the awareness that peace, in that year, is above all a Roman decision imposed with the strength of the legions. In 176 AD the Roman army does not fight major battles, but works. It is silent and continuous work, made of wood, earth, iron and effort, which transforms the truce into a crucial operational phase. Preparing for war while officially talking about peace is not a contradiction, but a necessity dictated by the experience of previous years. Marcus Aurelius and his commanders know that the stability of the Danube border does not depend on the signing of a treaty, but on the ability to react quickly to any sign of rupture. For this reason, 176 is a year in which the army is strengthened not so much in overall numbers, but in its structure, logistics, and operational readiness. The fortifications along the Danube and beyond the river are methodically consolidated. Reinforced palisades, deepened ditches, watchtowers placed to ensure rapid visual communication between the garrisons. It's not just about static defense, but about creating a network that allows you to control the territory and report any suspicious movement. Military roads, often overlooked in war stories, become central elements of strategy. They are repaired, expanded, kept accessible in every season, because the speed of movement of the troops is the real guarantee against sudden revolts. The bridges over the Danube and its tributaries are guarded with particular attention. Destroying them or losing control of them would mean isolating the advanced garrisons. In the camps, training continues without interruption. The legions, although tested by years of conflict, are kept in a state of rigorous discipline. The exercises are no longer oriented only towards pitched combat, but also towards the defense of positions, rapid marches, and small-scale containment operations. This reflects the nature of the conflict that Rome expects. Not major sudden invasions, but a series of local tensions, attempts at bypassing partial rebellions. Auxiliary units are taking on growing importance, especially those made up of archers, light cavalry and troops accustomed to moving quickly in difficult terrain. The Roman command exploited their mobility, but maintained a clear hierarchical distinction, aware that the loyalty of these troops, often recruited from recently defeated peoples, must be constantly confirmed through pay, control, and disciplinary integration. On a logistical level, 176 is a year of accumulation and rationalization. Military warehouses are filled with grain, weapons, and building materials, not only to support the garrisons present, but to ensure a reserve in the event of a sudden resumption of hostilities. This requires a coordinated effort between the army and the civil administration of the provinces, which must provide resources without compromising the survival of local populations. The management of supplies thus becomes a political issue as well as a military one, because a well-fed army but an impoverished province both risk turning into factors of instability. Marcus Aurelius follows these operations carefully, intervening in strategic decisions without going into technical detail, but maintaining an overall vision that takes into account the overall resources of the empire. His direct experience of war made him wary of simple, optimistic solutions. He knows that the strength of the army does not lie only in the courage of the soldiers, but in the continuity of supplies, the clarity of orders, and the predictability of responses. For this reason, in 176, each strengthening is thought of as part of a system, not as an isolated gesture. Managing troop morale is also part of this silent preparation. After years of harsh campaigns, the risk of tiredness and disaffection is real. Commanders try to balance severity and recognition, granting rewards, limited leave and marks of distinction to those who have distinguished themselves, without relaxing discipline. The idea that war could reignite at any moment is kept alive, not as a threat, but as a shared awareness. In this context, the Roman army of 176 appears as a force that has learned to live with uncertainty. It does not advance towards new conquests, but it does not dismantle its offensive capacity. It strengthens in the rear while guarding the border, preparing to move while remaining still. It is a less visible phase compared to the years of battles, but equally decisive, because it is here that the possibility of avoiding a new collapse of the front is at stake. 176, for the army, is a year of patient construction, in which every trench dug and every exercise repeated is an investment against the return of chaos. Rome does not trust peace, and for this reason it prepares as if war were only waiting for a pretext to start again. In 176 AD, while the Roman army presided over the border and consolidated its positions, war increasingly took on the face of the men who managed it. It is not an anonymous conflict, governed only by abstract orders, but a reality made up of commanders who interpret, apply, and sometimes adapt imperial directives to the concrete conditions of the terrain and of the troops. The Roman generals active on the Danube front in that year are not isolated or improvised figures, but products of a long military and administrative career, men who have gone through the hardest phases of the Marcomannic Wars and who now find themselves managing an armed peace, often more complex than open war. Their task is not to conquer new lands, but to maintain balance, prevent crises and intervene quickly when the situation requires it. This requires a combination of firmness and prudence that not all commanders possess, and Marcus Aurelius knows this well. For this reason, in 176, responsibilities were distributed carefully, avoiding excessive concentrations of power and maintaining a clear chain of command, in which each general responded directly to the imperial authority. Legion commanders operate in a context in which autonomy is necessary, but always supervised. Distances, communication difficulties, and the fragmented nature of the front make centralized direction on every detail impossible. At the same time, the experience of previous years has shown how quickly a local error can degenerate into a broader crisis. Generals must therefore make quick decisions on patrols, punishments, troop movements, but always within a strategy that favors stability. We do not seek conflict to demonstrate personal value, but we avoid unnecessary escalation. This marks an important difference compared to other phases of Roman history, in which the individual ambition of commanders often pushed towards aggressive campaigns. In 176, the priority is to maintain what has been achieved. Alongside high-ranking commanders, the fundamental role of intermediate officers emerges: tribunes, prefects, centurions. They are the ones who translate the directives into daily practice, manage relationships with the local populations, and maintain discipline in the camps. The centurion, in particular, remains the backbone of the Roman army. After years of hard war, many of them are veterans marked by the campaigns, men who have seen departments collapse and rebuild, and who in 176 represent an essential factor of continuity. Their authority does not derive only from rank, but from the experience shared with the soldiers, from the ability to maintain order without breaking morale. Auxiliary troops, often commanded by Roman officers but composed of men of non-Roman origin, also require careful management. In 176, these units are indispensable for territorial control and surveillance operations, but their integration remains a delicate process. Commanders must balance trust and control, knowing that loyalty is built over time and can crack under pressure. There is no shortage of episodes of tension, linguistic misunderstandings, internal rivalries, suspicions of double-dealing. The Roman response tends to be pragmatic, severely punishing cases of insubordination, but avoiding indiscriminate repression that could compromise overall effectiveness. Marcus Aurelius observes this system of men and roles with a gaze that combines realism and moral responsibility. He is not a distant emperor, and his direct experience on the front allows him to understand the concrete difficulties of command. The sources show him to be attentive to personal relationships with the generals, ready to listen to detailed reports and intervene when necessary, but also willing to delegate, aware that micromanagement would be ineffective. His leadership style in 176 reflects a maturity forged by war. Less emphasis on individual heroism, more attention to the overall stability of the system. In this context, episodes also emerge that illuminate the human dimension of the border war. Anecdotes handed down from sources speak of commanders who share the deprivations of the troops, of sudden inspections in the camps, of decisions taken on the spot to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. They are not spectacular gestures, but acts that contribute to maintaining a climate of trust and mutual respect. At the same time, discipline remains iron. Desertions, unauthorized looting or violence against subjugated populations are punished severely, because they undermine Roman credibility more than any military defeat. 176 is therefore a year in which the Roman command faces a different challenge. Not to win, but to govern the victory. Generals must demonstrate that they know how to be administrators as well as soldiers, mediators as well as fighters. It is a less celebrated role, but essential to the survival of the imperial order on the border. In this fragile balance between authority and adaptation, between strength and moderation, the very nature of the Marcomannic War in this phase is reflected, a conflict that is not resolved in a single decisive clash, but in the ability of concrete men to maintain, day after day, an armed peace imposed by the legions and supported by discipline. In 176 AD, the word truce never coincides with immobility. The absence of major campaigns does not mean silence of the weapons, but rather their intermittent, fragmented presence, often difficult to reconstruct in the sources because it is made up of minor episodes, skirmishes, punitive actions, and immediate reactions to violations of the agreements. It is a low-intensity but constant war that accompanies the entire year like background noise. The treaties imposed on the defeated peoples establish clear limits, but for this very reason they generate continuous tensions. Every trespassing, every suspicious movement, every armed gathering is interpreted as a possible threat. The Roman commands, mindful of the sudden explosions of violence of previous years, adopt a rapid, often preventive line of intervention, which aims to put out the outbreaks before they can turn into fires. The sources do not speak of large pitched battles in 176, but record a series of localized clashes, especially along the contact zones between the Roman garrisons and the tribal territories. These are often actions triggered by attempts to approach the Danube by barbaric groups, officially prohibited by the agreements. These movements may have different motivations: search for food, desire for commercial contact, desire to test Roman determination. In any case, the response of the legions is calibrated to be immediate and visible. Reinforced patrols are sent to intercept moving groups, and when the order is not respected, clashes become inevitable. From a strategic point of view, these episodes have a value that goes beyond the immediate outcome. We don't fight to gain ground, but to assert a rule. Every clash is a message. The line imposed by Rome is non-negotiable. The consequences are often asymmetrical: limited losses for the Romans, heavier losses for the barbarians, but above all a psychological effect that reinforces the perception of constant surveillance. In some cases, sources suggest that small rebel groups are deliberately allowed to get close to a certain point, only to be subjected to exemplary fire. It is a tactic that aims to discourage imitations, but which always carries the risk of escalation. Alongside these border clashes, there are targeted punitive actions against communities that have openly violated treaties. These operations do not take the form of large expeditions, but of rapid raids, conducted by mobile units that target specific villages, destroy resources, and take hostages. The goal is not total annihilation, but selective punishment. In this sense, the War of 176 is profoundly different from that of the years of maximum intensity. It is a war of signals, in which violence is an instrument of political communication. The consequences of these clashes are immediate but limited. There are no significant changes in the distribution of forces, nor sudden collapses of the Roman control system. However, each episode contributes to maintaining a climate of constant tension, which weighs on both the barbarians and the Roman troops. Soldiers live in a state of permanent alert, aware that danger does not come in the form of large armies, but of sudden attacks, ambushes, night shots. This psychological attrition is one of the least visible but most relevant aspects of conflict. On the barbarian side, the clashes of 176 show a fragmented reality. There is no single rebellion strategy, but a series of local, often uncoordinated, initiatives that reflect internal divisions within the tribes. Some leaders try to respect the agreements to consolidate their power with Roman support. Others violate them openly, driven by pressure from their communities or personal ambitions. Rome exploits these divisions, intervening in such a way as to isolate the rebels and strengthen the more docile interlocutors. It is a policy that produces short-term results, but which fuels underlying resentment. When sources allow, anecdotes also emerge that illuminate the nature of these minor clashes. There are stories of patrols surprised by sudden attacks and saved by the rapid reaction of the centurions, of soldiers fighting in extreme climatic conditions, of villages evacuated quickly to avoid Roman punishment. These are episodes that rarely enter into major celebratory accounts, but which constitute the daily plot of the border war. The military budget of 176, from the point of view of armed clashes, is therefore ambiguous. On the one hand, Rome maintains control and prevents the formation of new large hostile coalitions. On the other hand, the need to intervene repeatedly demonstrates that peace is far from consolidated. Every battle won strengthens Roman authority, but at the same time confirms that this authority must be continually reaffirmed. 176 is not a year of spectacular victories, but of resistance and vigilance, in which the absence of a major war is the result of a sum of small battles, fought away from the spotlight, but decisive in preventing the Danube border from falling back into chaos. When Marcus Aurelius returned to Rome in 176 AD, the distance between the Danube border and the city was not only geographical, but symbolic. In the north, war continues to exist as a real possibility. To the south, the capital of the empire must see, understand and accept that war has been won. The triumph of December 23 was born from this need, to translate a complex military reality, made up of armed truces and permanent control, into an understandable and reassuring political language. Rome does not celebrate the details, but the result, not the uncertainties, but the re-established authority. The triumph of Germanes and Sarmatus is the moment in which the imperial power presents itself as a guarantor of order, capable of protecting the borders and restoring security after years of fear and sacrifices. The preparation of the event follows an ancient ritual, full of layered meanings. Nothing is left to chance, because every gesture, every image, every word spoken must reinforce the idea of a victory achieved. The captured insignia, the weapons stolen from the enemies, the representations of the defeated peoples become elements of a visual narrative that passes through the city and speaks to a population that, for the most part, has only known the war through rumors and the economic consequences. The path of triumph, which passes through the most symbolic places of Rome, is not just a procession, but an act of reappropriation of urban space by the victorious military power. Marcus Aurelius, who for years ruled far from the capital, returns as a complete emperor, not only as an administrator and philosopher, but as a commander who defended the empire personally. The political significance of the triumph is amplified by its temporal location. Celebrating it at the end of the year means symbolically closing a phase, offering citizens the image of a cycle that ends with Roman success. The choice to wait until December 23 is not accidental. It allows us to accumulate news, consolidate the perception of stability on the front and prepare public opinion for a single message. Rome sees the loot and prisoners parade by, but above all it sees an emperor who has kept his promise of protection. Imperial propaganda insists on the defensive nature of the war, presenting the Danube campaigns as a necessary response to barbarian aggression, not as a war of conquest. This element is central, because it strengthens the moral image of Marcus Aurelius, consistent with his reputation as a just ruler and reluctant to use violence. The triumph does not erase the suffering, but sublimates it in a story of resistance and re-established order. During the celebration, the army takes on a visible but disciplined role. The marching legions represent not only military strength, but also the continuity of the state. Many of the soldiers present have fought for years far from home, and their appearance in Rome is a public recognition of the sacrifice made. At the same time, the ritual of triumph reminds us that the army is at the service of the empire and the emperor, not an autonomous actor. This dimension is particularly important in a period in which prolonged military command could fuel personal ambitions. Marcus Aurelius, aware of these risks, also uses the triumph as a tool for the symbolic reintegration of the army into civil life, at least on an image level. The Senate and the Roman elites participate in the celebration with an attitude that mixes respect and relief. The Marcomannic Wars took their toll on public finances and the administration of the provinces, and the triumph offers the opportunity to present those costs as a necessary and justified investment. The titles of Germanes and de Sarmatus, officially recognized, fix in the public memory the idea of a double victory, on two distinct fronts, strengthening the perception of a broad and definitive success. In reality, as the commanders and the emperor himself know well, the situation on the border remains fragile, but this awareness finds no place in the official narrative. Triumph is, by its nature, a selective act, showing what is needed to consolidate power. The most significant aspect of the celebration is perhaps the contrast between the solemnity of the event and the personal sobriety of Marcus Aurelius. The sources insist on his moderation, on the lack of excesses, on an attitude that reflects duty more than exaltation. This does not reduce the impact of the triumph, but directs it in a particular direction. Not the apotheosis of a conqueror, but the confirmation of an emperor who did what was necessary to safeguard the empire. The message is powerful precisely because it avoids excessive emphasis, letting traditional ritual speak for itself. For the Roman people, the triumph of 176 represents a moment of unity and relief. After years marked by news of invasions, devastation and crises, seeing the victorious emperor restores confidence in the state's ability to face threats. It is a trust that is based more on image than on detailed knowledge of the facts, but which plays an essential function in maintaining the empire. The triumph is not the end of the war, but it is the moment in which Rome chooses to believe that order has been re-established. In this sense, the celebration of December 23, 176 is less a point of arrival than an act of political will, a public affirmation that the empire, despite the difficulties, remains master of its own destiny. In the triumph of December 23, 176 AD, there is a detail that captures attention more than any trophy exhibited: the presence of Commodus next to his father. It is not an ornamental gesture, nor an emotional concession, but a precise political act, full of meaning for those who know how to read the language of Roman power. Commodus is 15 years old, an age in which the Roman aristocracy was still forming, but already old enough to be shown as an integral part of the imperial destiny. Riding on the triumphal chariot together with Marcus Aurelius means being exposed to the gaze of the city as the designated heir, as the continuer of the victory, as a figure already included in the sphere of military and political responsibility. In that public image is concentrated a dynastic choice that Marcus Aurelius developed over time, and which found its symbolic consecration in 176. Commodus is not presented as a protected child, but as a young prince associated with the success of the empire. The message is clear: stability is not just about the present, but also about the future. After years of wars that tested the structures of the state, the idea of an orderly succession becomes an integral part of the narrative of victory. The Roman people, seeing father and son together in the most solemn moment of military recognition, are invited to imagine continuity without fractures. From a formal point of view, Commodus' presence on the triumphal chariot marks his official debut as a leading public figure. It is not the first time he appears alongside his father, but it is the first occasion on which he is directly and visibly associated with a military command, even if in a symbolic form. He did not lead armies or make strategic decisions, but his image is linked to those victories that Rome celebrates as definitive. This is not unusual in imperial history, but in the case of Marcus Aurelius it takes on a particular significance, because it occurs in a context of still unfinished war and fragile peace. Showing the heir means strengthening confidence in the fact that the established order does not depend exclusively on the person of the reigning emperor. The figure of Commodus is carefully constructed. The sources describe him as a young man with a well-groomed appearance, educated according to the canons of the Roman aristocracy, already included in a training course that includes physical training, rhetorical instruction, and familiarity with the military environment. In 176, Commodus had already accompanied his father to the front, lived in the fields, observed the reality of war closely, even if protected by rank and distance from the toughest decisions. This experience is now capitalized on a symbolic level. His presence in the triumph suggests that he is no stranger to the efforts that led to the victory. For the army, seeing the young prince associated with the supreme commander has a specific value. The legions, accustomed to a leadership that in recent years has been embodied almost exclusively in the figure of Marcus Aurelius, are invited to also recognize his son as part of that continuity. This is not a formal investiture in the field, but a first step in building a relationship of mutual recognition. The implicit message is that Commodus will not be a ruler distant from military realities, but someone who has already shared, at least in part, the life of the army. This representation is fundamental in a period in which the loyalty of the troops is one of the key elements of imperial stability. The Senate also grasps the significance of the event. The presence of Commodus in the triumph strengthens the dynastic dimension of power, reducing the uncertainty that often accompanies transitions. Marcus Aurelius, who could also have chosen different solutions, publicly confirmed his desire to pass on the empire to his son, linking this choice to a moment of consensus and celebration. It is a politically astute move, because it takes advantage of the positive atmosphere of the triumph to consolidate a decision which, in other contexts, might have aroused resistance or doubts. In 176, however, the figure of Commodus is still that of a promise, not of a judgment. The sources record no open criticism or explicit doubts about its suitability. The idea of a young man who has yet to prove his worth, but who is guided by an expert and respected father prevails. From a symbolic point of view, the image of the philosopher father and the warrior son in training creates an effective narrative balance. Marcus Aurelius embodies wisdom and sacrifice. Commodus represents the energy of the future. This construction is not random, but responds to a specific need for legitimation. The empire, exhausted by years of conflict, needs to believe not only in the end of the war, but also in the continuity of the power that made it possible. The young Commodus, on the triumphal chariot, thus becomes an integral part of the official story of the Marcomannic Wars, not a protagonist, but a privileged witness, destined to collect the legacy of that moment. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this scene is its ambiguity. For the public of 176, Commodus is a positive symbol, a sign of stability and the future. For the historian, however, this image concentrates all the hopes and unknowns of a dynastic succession in a period of strong pressure. Without leaving the scope of that year, what emerges is Marcus Aurelius' desire to ideally close the hardest phase of the war by presenting not only a victory, but a line of continuity. In 176, Commodus is not yet a fulfilled destiny, but a figure under construction, exposed to the light of triumph as a guarantee that Rome, at least apparently, does not fear tomorrow. At the end of 176 AD, the Roman Empire found itself in a condition that can only be defined with caution: stable, but not pacified. The balance of the year is not measured in conquered territories or annihilated enemies, but in Rome's ability to maintain a balance that remains fragile and artificial. On the Danube border, Roman garrisons continue to garrison lands that do not formally belong to the empire, but which suffer its daily presence. The treaties imposed on defeated peoples hold, not because they are accepted, but because they are supported by a military force that is visible and ready for intervention. The Marcomanni, the Quadi and the Sarmatians do not have the concrete possibility of resuming a coordinated offensive, but they retain a capacity for disturbance which forces Rome to remain vigilant. The Peace of 176 is therefore a military construction, not a shared agreement. From a strategic point of view, the year ended without significant defeats and without sudden crises, and this, in the context of the Marcomannic Wars, is already a significant result. The army has maintained its cohesion, consolidated infrastructure, contained local tensions and demonstrated that it can exercise effective control even in the absence of major campaigns. At the same time, the price of this stability is high. Men far from home, resources constantly absorbed by the front, continuous pressure on the border provinces. There is no sign of general demobilization, nor the illusion that the problem is definitively resolved. Rome does not lower its guard, and this prudent attitude is perhaps the clearest lesson that emerges from the year. Marcus Aurelius, observing the overall picture, appears as a ruler aware of the limits of victory. The triumph celebrated in Rome does not lead him to dismantle the control system built with so much effort. On the contrary, the year ends with the confirmation of a strong and organized military presence, a sign that the emperor does not confuse the celebration with strategic reality. His personal experience of the war, gained in the field, prevents him from giving in to easy optimism. 176 is a transition year for him, in which the main task is not to win again, but to prevent losing what has been achieved. Even on the internal political level, the balance is complex but positive. The triumph strengthened the consensus around the imperial figure, reassured the people and the elites, presented the Danubian Wars as a test overcome. Commodus' public association with military success added an element of dynastic continuity that contributes to the perception of stability. It is not just propaganda, but a choice that responds to a real need. After years of crisis, the empire needs to believe in the solidity of its institutions and in the predictability of the future. In this sense, 176 performs an almost therapeutic function, offering a psychological break after a long season of emergency. However, beneath this tidy surface, there remain signs that call for caution. The barbarian populations are not integrated, but controlled. The army is efficient, but tired. The provinces are holding up, but under constant pressure. Nothing indicates an imminent collapse, but nothing authorizes us to talk about a definitive peace. The Danube border remains a place of latent tension, where order depends on the continuity of the Roman commitment. It's an equilibrium that works as long as the empire is willing to bear the costs. 176 therefore ends as a year of suspension, rather than of conclusion. It is the year in which Rome chooses to believe it has re-established order, despite knowing that that order is fragile. It is the year in which the war, although not over, is momentarily put aside in the official narrative. Marcus Aurelius, who knows the weight of political illusions, seems to accept this necessity without being completely fooled by it. He governs like someone who knows that peace is a process, not a definitive state. 176 AD is the year in which the Roman Empire looks at the Danube border and, for a moment, sees a line that holds. Not because the world beyond was transformed, but because Rome's strength, discipline, and political will manage to impose an armed truce. It is the year of triumph, but also of waiting, of the heir shown to the people, but still in formation, of the war that moves away from the capital, but does not disappear. All the lucidity of Marcus Aurelius is reflected in this unstable balance, an emperor aware that true victory is not celebrating the end of a conflict, but preventing it from resuming when the illusion of peace seems strongest.